What is ongoing consent and why should you care? I'm here with Victor Salmon from victorsalmon.com and I'm Kathy Mertoli from theintimacydojo.com. Victor, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you've used this, we've done a couple of videos so far today, and you've talked about ongoing consent. Can you explain what it is and why do we care?
I consent to do that. So the notion of ongoing consent is after you have done an activity with someone, had sex, done a cute scene, etc., what about 2 or 3 days later? Do they still feel like that event was consensual at the time?
Yeah.
A lot of the times we don't have an excellent, certainly not an omniscient perception of what's happening. You can have one situation where two people leave that room with radically different experiences. And I think our society comes from this very colonial, contractual, agreement-focused, you have to make good on your word and your promises, no matter what it costs you. Like, it prizes integrity to others above integrity to the self in a lot of cases. And I think that collectivist attitude is really bad for rape culture. I think if we try and negotiate our sexual encounters based on prior consent only, we're missing a larger part of the picture. So there's obviously prior consent, making sure you have consent before you start an interaction like having sex. There's continuing consent. The consent is always withdrawable throughout that interaction.
Unless you live in North Carolina where it doesn't matter.
Unless you live in North Carolina. Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, if you said yes once, you can't tell them to stop partway through because that's not fair.
I have no idea how it is possible at that level. So the funny thing is, the notion of partway through and what sex is so fucking like cis-normative.
It's this whole trajectory where you do this, then like...
It's outstanding to me because, you know, if your girlfriend in the middle of sex whips out a strap-on and holds you down and fucks you in the ass, how could that possibly be rape? You said yes.
Yeah, exactly.
For what did you say yes? Like, it's insanity to me that could ever be a thing. But back to the topic in time. So in developed parts of the world that have what I would consider a good human rights focused approach to how individuals interact and where that's legislated, so North Carolina, sorry North Carolina humans, I hate to rip on your legislation, but what the actual living fuck is going on anyways? So you have continuing consent through a thing where you can withdraw that consent at any time and just have people respect you and your bodily autonomy and saying, yeah, you're not cool with this, let's renegotiate. There's always more sex to be had in the future for comfortable, consenting, happy individuals.
Yeah.
Wow. And then after that continuing consent, when you've done a thing, there's ongoing consent. And I think the very best thermometer for whether or not your interaction was consensual is ongoing consent. And most of these ideas I developed out of a rape play class that I went to with Jim Duvall. He taught a rape play class at a West Coast Bound in Vancouver, BC. And I'm so grateful to the organizers of that year for bringing him in because I learned so much more about consent in a rape play class than I ever learned in school, than I ever learned in a consent class.
Yeah.
It is like BDSM, and the closer you get to that hairier edge of what is helping someone stay emotionally healthy as you do this activity with them.
Yeah.
Like the closer you get to that hairier edge of this might not be consensual, the greater the focus has to be on consent and the better I've found consent education. And I think that's been universal. Even when I've gone to vanilla consent education that's been really stellar, it's almost always come out of, say, if you look at cuddle parties, which are essentially a consent workshop, you see Marsha Baczynski out of San Francisco, askingforwhatyouwant.com, I think. She's amazing and does incredible work. And the same has been true for the Consent Crew in Vancouver, BC, which is also based out of askingforwhatyouwant.com. And like a lot of those concepts out of San Francisco Kink influenced Vancouver vanilla consent education. So it's...
I guess I have an abuse history, and I've had lots of sex where in the moment I was very much a yes. All the way through I was a yes. I felt great, like as we wrapped up, And like the next morning, like just being close to someone can stir up things. It wasn't that they did anything wrong, they said anything wrong, but the next day I felt really crappy. And there was part of my brain going, I never want to have sex again. That I don't like, it was awful because of my old stuff. But that doesn't reflect on the person that I just had sex with. So I'm a little like, how would I balance that with ongoing consent where I don't feel very consensual the day after?
That's a great question. And there's just because a person has had an experience that in the day after or the ongoing time frame that they feel that was a terrible experience doesn't necessarily mean they feel it was a non-consensual experience or that the person they were with did something expressly non-consensual.
We can have regretful sex that's not non-consensual.
Absolutely we can. And there's a distinction there. At the same time, I feel we have a burden to be accountable and responsible to the people we interact with. Maybe it's not a 100% you are legally obligated to be responsible to this human, but if you had an interaction with a human and they had a really bad interaction with you, I think it is totally reasonable to say, hey, I am making a request for some assistance here, for some support. We did this thing, I had a terrible experience from it, and I want to hold you somewhat accountable. There's obviously a line there between this person didn't disclose that they had an abuse history because they didn't know it was relevant.
Yeah.
And that's fair. Whether it's an invisible mental illness or an invisible disability or just an abuse history, if it's not relevant, you don't necessarily have a burden to inform absolutely everybody that you're a person who suffers with depression.
I've healed a lot. I mean, a lot of times it doesn't come at all, and then occasionally it does, and I'm like, oh my God,
right.
Wow.
Right. So there's obviously a lot of gray area there. Mm-hmm. And I think it comes down to what standard are we holding ourselves to? Are we holding ourselves to a minimum standard, or are we holding ourselves to a standard of trying to leave people better than we found them? And I think if we can hold ourselves to that standard of doing our best, and we're not always going to make that standard, we're not always going to be perfect, and we're not always going to even be as good as we want to be as individuals. That's going to happen, and that's okay. But I think making that effort to hold ourselves to that accountability of being the best humans we can, at the very least of being responsible to people we directly interact with. I had amazing sex with this person. I feel great and respectful and grateful that I had this amazing sexual experience. Oh, it actually turned out to be really awful for that person. Cool. How can I support you in this moment? What do you need from me? Do you need space? Do you need to talk? Do you need to feel heard? Do you need someone to rant at? And I will do my best to not be defensive and acknowledge that to the best of that person I was in that moment, I was doing the best I could with the information I had. Maybe that landed really, really badly for you, and I can listen to you and hear you talk about how this was related to past abuse, how this was related to what you perceive as abuse in that moment, which for you, if you perceive it as such, it was. Mm-hmm. So it's really a question of not gaslighting people, not trying to convince them of something, not trying to persuade them, just being able to be present, actively listen, do your best to be responsible, and show them that compassion and that space, to hold that space for them, and just hold your mind open that maybe there were these invisible power dynamics at play. Maybe I accidentally was coercing their consent when I thought what I was doing was 100% consensual, but actually there were some factors that I wasn't aware of that were really coercing that person to say yes in that moment.
Right. I like that analogy, because to me it's like there's a difference between I'm going to set the scene so they feel kind of pushed to say yes. I'm going to wait till they're a little drunk or a little high on the touch before I ask for things, and then thinking that I'm going to get what I want, and then later on that ongoing consent isn't there because I set the tone that they were more likely to say yes because I wanted that, versus, hey, let's try this thing. We're both saying yes to do it. It doesn't work really well. There's just not that chemistry there, and it's like kind of, well, that sucks. That sex kind of sucked, and I kind of regret that I had it.
Yeah.
That's very different from like, this person set the tone, so I said yes, and the next day I'm like, I wish I'd never done that.
Right, and I think some of that, not that I'm in any way trying to apologize or explain away any of rape or sexual assault. It's fucking awful. It is what it is. I'm a survivor of abuse myself, and of sexual assault. I think it's important to recognize the communities and the cultures that this happens in, and recognize that as communities, we do hold some responsibility of making our communities inhospitable to sexual assault behaviors and making it as hard as possible for people to commit sexual assault. And that doesn't come through a punitive lens of, oh, this person committed sexual assault, they're a horrible, shameful human being, let's kill them, let's injure them, let's shame them out of our community. I mean, I'm not saying people don't have a right to be angry, and I'm not saying that sometimes people are going to dispense some vigilante justice. That's not me. That is not what I'm about. I would never encourage that. I also don't judge people for doing that. I tend to take, there's an amazing anarchist article called Accounting for Ourselves. Google it. It's amazing if you're looking into restorative justice. It stresses that vigilante justice is not a failed accountability process. It's a direct response to harm. And I think that's a really neat distinction.
So it's called Counting for Ourselves?
Accounting
for ourselves. Yeah. Great.
And
Thank you.
Other great readings. I will find you links for after the video.
Okay, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, you're very well read and informed on this, so I appreciate you sharing.
No one can read everything. I try very hard to do my best to do this research because it's so challenging to develop a universal framework. I've actually split it into special accountability and general accountability because cis-het men committing violence against cis-het women is so prevalent and endemic and so underaddressed and such a large portion of the accountability problem. It really deserves its own focus. However, one can't exclusively make that the target of one's accountability process because it's not queer focused. It excludes, in a lot of cases, the situations that may come up for people of color and the intersections of how being a het cis woman but being one of color suddenly brings this whole realm of yes, and I can't bring, for example, one example, a US example, the whole complex of white racist police society down on my partner. What does that say about me as a black person if I'm invoking this super racist, potentially lethal resource against my partner? So there's this huge resistance to involving legal systems. There's a lack of access to legal response. So what does that then say about violence? It changes the ground, the whole layout of domestic violence is different suddenly in a way that most people don't think if they are part of the dominant culture, the white cis majority.
Yeah.
So yes, we have to have special accountability, and we also have to have a general accountability framework that doesn't leave people behind.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's so nuanced. Like, a lot of it is very subtle, and where the line is, it is not always clear. But just talking about it and going, hey, which is this? I think that gives us a lot more power versus, oh, that's scary, I'm just going to try not to do anything bad, which leaves us very small and not very engaged with our community.
Yes.
So, if you'd like to support Victor, please go to patreon.com/Victor Salmon, and please leave comments and questions below. We'd love to hear from you.